Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing Ian Fleming's ninth James Bond novel, Thunderball, released in 1961. But this is the one novel with the most amount of baggage, because in order to understand why this novel is the way it is, you have to understand the long development process, and that this is a book that is not entirely a work of Ian Fleming's. And you also have to know about the eventual court case that developed between Fleming and Ivar Bryce versus Kevin McClory and also screenwriter Jack Whittingham. All of this has come to be known as the Thunderball Saga, and this also explains how Kevin McClory wound up with rights to the Thunderball story and kept popping up over the years trying to create rival James Bond film projects. So to analyze the novel properly, or to understand Thunderball at all, you have to go all the way back to the start of the project. Thunderball began life as an attempt to make a James Bond feature film and to get a potential series off the ground. This was a partnership between Ian Fleming, Ivar Bryce, who was his friend and who was essentially bankrolling most of this enterprise, and Kevin McClory, who was handling the creative and filmmaking side of things. So it was a collaboration between the three, and they formed their own company and partnership to create a James Bond feature film. Over time, things hadn't gone quite so well, and a number of years had gone by, and there was essentially a lot of misgivings that developed, particularly due to McClory's business style and there being a real lack of proper communication between all parties. And so the partnership should have been dissolved, or other people should have been brought in to mediate things. But unfortunately, all the parties involved by that point had not really seen eye to eye for so long, and didn't try to break up the partnership in the best ways. And so there was a lot of difficulty in trying to sort out this giant mess, let alone actually get a fully funded distribution deal with a major studio. And also the story was still being developed and had already seen a long period of treatments and screenplay drafts and revisions and rewrites, and had also seen the introduction of Jack Whittingham as the film's screenwriter, brought in to basically take the various treatments that Ian Fleming had written and also worked with McClory on and gone back and rewritten. And so it was Whittingham who really figured out how to structure the story and take all these disparate ideas that, were good and solid in Fleming's treatments from what we can glean from the summaries we can read. But Whittingham was the person who advanced the project further and got it more into a workable screenplay. You also have to keep in mind that the story was being developed in the 1950s. It is forward-looking in how it's looking at the hijacking of atomic weapons and doing that plot before others had really latched on to it. It is still a plot that works today, but because it was written in the 1950s for a 1950s film that didn't happen for a 1950s film audience who was not familiar with the character of James Bond, it means there's always going to be this inherent quality of other voices and textures and styles within Thunderball itself. And so if you've ever read the novel or seen the film or seen Never Say Never Again, the 1983 remake of Thunderball, and felt a certain distance or even a sort of coldness inherent, that there's certain elements that you can't quite put your finger on, or moments that don't quite feel in keeping with other James Bond experiences or films or novels, or if there's just some reason you couldn't quite figure out why it didn't rank among your absolute favorite entries in the series, either in the books or the films, it all goes back to how the story was developed as a 1950s film with other people in addition to Ian Fleming for a 1950s film audience. So you have to understand that going forward, because it informs everything afterwards. Even though the novel is written by Fleming and has a lot of his DNA inserted in there, and he came up with unique sequences throughout, and then Richard Maibaum wrote a 1961 script, which then got repurposed into the 1965 film with additional further rewrites to then bring it in line with what the Eon films had established in the first three films, and to be even bigger than Goldfinger. And then, of course, Never Say Never Again in 1983 is doing its own thing, reworking Thunderball, trying to avoid legal problems from Eon breathing down their neck. but it's still tied all the way back to things that originated in the 1950s treatments and scripts. So you can never get away from that. So it always locks Thunderball as a story, regardless of which form you're enjoying it in, to this point in time and to the partnership that broke up and led to the legal case. Now, the whole reason why there was a court case was because Fleming published Thunderball as an original novel in 1961. He had his setup of going to his home, Goldeneye in Jamaica, and writing a Bond novel every year. And he had already expressed that he was starting to run short of ideas and looking for something to spark his creative batteries, essentially. And a lot of that energy had gone into this Thunderball project that hadn't gotten anywhere. It had even gone through a variety of titles. And so, like he had done in the past, he took a James Bond project that he had worked on or written or co-written and decided to turn that into his next Bond novel. It's unknown for sure if there was much questioning going into writing the Thunderball novel of can you exactly do this legally? Is this really a good idea? How are the other people going to feel about it? Or perhaps there was some sense that because he was the creator and owner of the property and the character and had written the original treatments and done rewrites and been a main collaborator, that he had some sort of additional creative rights. It's very muddled. And there's also some discussion in the scholarship that Kevin McClory was aware Fleming might write this into a novel, and it would be a great way to promote the project for an American studio, most likely, to provide financial backing and distribution. So it's not a problem that Fleming wrote a novel. It's a problem that he didn't attribute the novel being drawn from the Thunderball screenplays that had been co-written and developed with Kevin McClory and Jack Whittingham, also with Ivor Bryce, and the original concept coming from Fleming's great friend Ernest Cuneo. So Johnathan Cape goes to publish Thunderball, and Kevin McClory sees an advance copy and sees no mention or credit of the screenplay or credit for him or Jack Whittingham, and of course is, shall we say, not thrilled. So this led to the court case that eventually got to the High Courts of London and was ongoing for quite some time, and it was not very good for Fleming's health. It is thought that the stresses of the court case facilitated or hastened his death in 1964. It certainly didn't help matters much, nor did it help Jack Whittingham's own health concerns. So it was a stressful time for all involved, and it's truly unfortunate that the partnership between everyone basically imploded for a variety of different reasons, and the novel came out without credit and led to all of this. Eventually, the case was settled out of court, and McClory got the rights to the Thunderball story to make as a film, and then Fleming had the rights to the novel, but the novel had to be published with the appropriate credits, saying that it was drawn from the screenplays and story development between Fleming, Jack Whittingham, and Kevin McClory. That credit should have always been there, I think, had the novel been prepared and published with that in there and with the correct percentages and royalties going to Jack Whittingham and Kevin McClory. I don't think there would have been an issue. That's the real problem and what led to the court case and the whole Thunderball saga. I don't think it's an issue that Fleming decided to turn the still in progress screenplay that was starting to look like it wasn't going to go much of anywhere into a book. That's perfectly fine, but it should have been properly credited, and it wasn't. So that's the problem that led to the court case. But the whole Thunderball saga lasts several years, and you really have to dig into the minutia of it. And we as James Bond fans weren't really able to do that until the indispensable book The Battle for Bond came out by Robert Sellers, which digs into all of the history and gives you a blow-by-blow, extraordinarily detailed accounting of the genesis of the partnership, the idea to make a James Bond film on their own, to then eventually have to seek financing and distribution from a major studio, the various stars and directors they tried and approached, the original treatments that Ian Fleming wrote that are the first versions of the Thunderball concept, the whole reason why they decided to do an original story in the first place, because Kevin McClory thought all of Fleming's Bond novels were apparently just not good enough for a film. And that doesn't give you a whole bunch of confidence as a Bond fan when you're reading the story of this, that the main creative partner doesn't think the Bond novels to that point are any good. But you can also start to see where heads kind of butted together and how some of the ideas they had were a bit lofty in terms of being an independent film production unit in the mid to late 1950s, and James Bond not being a proven commercial property quite yet, because the novels, while they were growing in popularity, they were not extraordinarily well known. So this film was going to have to introduce the character to a new audience, and specifically, it was going to have to translate to an American audience, which was the key concept that the Eon films realized from the get-go. And that's why part of the James Bond formula of the famous films was to translate everything to an American audience without losing the essential Britishness or British qualities of the character. So you can see elements that would eventually be done in Dr. No in 1962, but in their primordial version here, but also taking things in different ways. And you can start to see how the Thunderball story emerges from various treatments and scripts that were originally called things like Longitude 78 West. You can also see different paths they took and certain things that obviously didn't quite work, and so those were refined or changed or thrown out entirely. You can also see in Fleming's original treatments how they were much closer to his literary Bond style, and there are certain echoes of his other books that you can feel here, as if James Bond on a new adventure, but also could be seen as the first James Bond adventure because it's introducing a whole audience worldwide to this character they may have never heard of. It's the introduction of Jack Whittingham that really elevated the whole creative process of Thunderball, because he was the one who figured out how to structure the story and how to do the hijacking of the bombs and how to weave in the plot threads that had already been established and have all of the underwater material, which was one of McClory's big fixations, and his idea was to shoot the film in the Bahamas and essentially build a miniature film industry of sorts and do things no one had ever done and sell the film as a big roadshow experience, possibly using the large format Todd AO system that had been used by Mike Todd on Around the World in 80 Days. And so that's really the sort of vision McClory had for the film. And I think you can start to see that you have three creative entities in this process that all have different visions of the film they're making. And as the breakdowns in communication started building and the sort of splitting into factions kept increasing, and Fleming and Ivar Bryce had more and more concerns about not just McClory as a businessman, but as a filmmaker who perhaps was not as, shall we say, accomplished as he sort of made himself to be. And the film he made as a sort of calling card, The Boy in the Bridge, while it did win some festival awards, it was not very successful and disappeared rather quickly. So you can start to see how things mounted, and eventually the project had gotten to almost essentially the Thunderball we know. And then that's when Fleming decided to use it for the basis of his new James Bond novel that year. So the novel was released in 1961, and due to the court case, that locked up the story for quite some time, which is why Eon, since they had made their deal by that point, could not do it as their first film adaptation. The original idea was to make Thunderball as the first film, but later it was realized it was a blessing in disguise because the story was much bigger, and they didn't have the budget to pull off an appropriate version of Thunderball. It would have been underfunded and just not worked properly. So, of course, the first film was Dr. No, which is a much smaller story in scope and was a perfect initial film for the series. However, this meant that after the court case, McClory has the rights to Thunderball, but he can't do anything with it because there was already a series ongoing that was becoming increasingly successful, and no other studio would finance him or back him or approve him because they'd be competing with an already proven series that eventually became a world phenomenon in 1964. So eventually McClory had to make a deal with Eon for making Thunderball in 1965, which changed the whole process of how Eon was going, because originally they were going to do On Her Majesty's Secret Service after Goldfinger, for example. Of course, the saga didn't end there, as McClory retained rights and also claimed rights to the Spectre organization. However, the contract also stipulated that 10 years after the 1965 Thunderball film, McClory would be free to do something else with his James Bond rights. So sure enough, in 1975, guess who pops up and announces his intentions to make his James Bond film? And eventually he was able to secure both Lynn Dayton and Sean Connery himself to work on the script, with the intent to try and get Connery to star as James Bond once again. Eventually this project went under the title of Warhead, or Warhead 75, and actually saw completed scripts, and you can read about it online. And it does sound fascinating, but it is, once again, remaking the Thunderball plot and concept, because that's all he had the rights to, and additionally, he could claim rights to the Spectre organization. Eon was not too thrilled about this, and this led to the on and off sense of McClory being the thorn in their side, and a whole series of seemingly never-ending legal battles back and forth to try and prevent a rival film production. But this also meant McClory could say that Eon was using his material when they used the Spectre organization. So, for example, this meant he tried to make claims about the forthcoming The Spy Who Loved Me having elements of his Thunderball material, so any mention or usage of Spectre was removed, and everything was changed to the villain Carl Stromberg. So that became a sort of back and forth for some time, until eventually, with producer Jack Schwartzman, McClory was able to mount his own Thunderball remake, and that wound up being 1983's Never Say Never Again, which was a rival to that year's official Eon film Octopussy. But Never Say Never Again had to very closely stick to the Thunderball original plot as to not risk any sort of litigation. And the saga didn't end there, because McClory still tried to use his James Bond rights afterwards and once again make Thunderball over throughout the rest of the 1980s and the 90s and into the 2000s, and eventually his rights wound up getting back to Eon as part of an acquisition deal. McClory's rights had wound up at Sony, and Sony made a deal with MGM in the mid to late 2000s to get any remaining Spider-Man rights that MGM had acquired over the years. Sony did a trade and essentially gave them the McClory rights and also the remaining rights to Casino Royale, which dated back to Columbia producing the 1967 spoof film, which itself dated back to the original rights being sold to do the 1954 CBS Climax live television adaptation. And that's how the other outstanding James Bond rights finally got back to Eon. But that's how the saga finally ended. But it all goes back to the original concept of trying to make a successful James Bond feature film as an independent venture between Ian Fleming, Ivar Bryce, and Kevin McClory in the 1950s. It all goes back there. All of the story concepts and ideas go all the way back to the beginning, but you have to do a detailed study of how all of this developed to try and figure out who came up with what, or where certain concepts were introduced. And you also have to then look at what happened to everyone in the aftermath of the court case, because, as I said, Fleming himself did not live very much longer, and the case is seen to have adversely affected his health. And poor Jack Whittingham didn't really get anything, because while he was there in the case with McClory and supporting McClory, he didn't really get any financial compensation and wasn't included in the deal with Eon for the 1965 Thunderball, and he kind of was left scratching his head afterwards, and obviously didn't really feel all that great about the whole experience. He did feel sorry, like Fleming had, that the whole thing had come to this, and I don't think anyone intended for there eventually to be a big sort of court case. So in the aftermath of the court case, case, you have the addition of the credit for Thunderball copies. So all versions of the novel have to carry the particular credit. This story is based on a screen treatment by Kevin McClory, Jack Whittingham, and the author. And that means you have to look at Thunderball and try to figure out, okay, what parts come from Fleming? What parts did he add that are unique to the novel? Because there are quite a number of them. That's why I get quite frustrated when people claim that the novel is simply plagiarism, which it's a very difficult thing to try and label it one particular thing, because you have to then venture into researching the court case, and you really have to look at the development process, and that way you can start to see, okay, these things are from Jack Whittingham in terms of his screenplay drafts, but then a lot of elements go all the way back to Fleming's original story treatments or the original concept, which was essentially a very short idea generated by Ernest Cuneo, who basically donated it to get the project started. But then you have to try to figure out Kevin McClory's input, and he was more of the ideas man and facilitator, it seems. So it goes back and forth between all three creative voices. But there are certainly unique Fleming exclusive aspects of the novel that make it his literary Bond style and make it part of his existing James Bond series of novels. So it isn't just a novel version of the screenplay at its final point it had gotten to when Fleming went and wrote the book version. It's also reverting back to things that he had in his original treatments that McClory didn't like or had been changed, but it is also using some of the improvements and things that Jack Whittingham brought to it, specifically his structuring. So it should have always been credited properly. That's the big issue with Thunderball as a novel. Whether the film had ever actually gotten made, the book should have been properly credited. It was a mistake and absolutely wrong to just try and sell it as Fleming's own original work without acknowledging what it was drawn from. I don't think Fleming had any sense of ill will or malice. I think it was more of just being a bit reckless or not exactly knowing the ins and outs of the laws surrounding the creation of materials, not to mention copyright laws. And even if you're unsure, you always need to give credit where credit is due, because you have to then go through the book and try to identify who did what or where each line came from. And that is what they did in the court case. They started going through the Thunderball novel, comparing line by line with the various screenplays. So it should have always been credited properly. And unfortunately, it didn't really end well for either Fleming or Ivar Bryce or Jack Whittingham, most of all. He actually remained friendly with everyone. And again, no one really had ill will towards one another, but it was very much a shame that it had gotten to this point. And while McClory won in the settlement, Jack Whittingham didn't really win anything except getting his name properly credited in the Thunderball novel and some sort of credit in the eventual films. He didn't get the monetary gain that McClory did and was left out of all of that. So in all of this, it's poor Jack Whittingham who got left holding the bag, essentially. And he was the one who did a lot of the heavy lifting and developing the story and getting it to the shape of the Thunderball we know. And had the film been made and actually been successful, it would have been a great boost to his own career, as he was already a well-known and respected screenwriter, but he had to take several years out of that career and put into this project that became a whole big mess, and it didn't help his career all that much. So it must have been something that he just carried with him for the rest of his career and probably tried to not think about all that much. But I think it's ridiculous that McClory basically left Whittingham out to dry, and then, of course, this didn't help Fleming's already fragile health, and he wound up passing away in 1964, with his death most obviously hastened by the stresses of this court case. And it put stress upon him and his friendship with Ivar Bryce. So it wasn't good for anyone. But ultimately, the novel was finally released with the correct credits, and led to further success for the literary James Bond, which furthered the sort of foundation for the successful launch of the Eon films the next year with Dr. No in 1962. So I know that was really long-winded, but you have to at least understand the basic points of the Thunderball Saga to then look at Thunderball as a novel, because it does feel different from every other book that Fleming wrote. And that's because it's being generated out of this project that was done with two other voices. So it's not entirely Fleming material. So unlike For Your Eyes Only and Dr. No, which were taken from projects that Fleming wrote for things that never got made, and then he transitioned them into being new original James Bond material, Thunderball is something that he wrote with other people, and even though he put his own spin on it and added tons of his own material and went back to some of his original concepts, it's not entirely Fleming. So there are points in the Thunderball novel, and thus all its adaptations, that at least in some areas have a little bit of the flavor of Ian Fleming's James Bond being a guest star in someone else's story. I don't think there's really any escaping that, and I think that's why the novel is not as effective as all of Fleming's previous novels. I think when you read the series in publication order, you feel this inherently, and for me, it's always been one of the weakest novels. Of course, reading the book and growing up, you don't know about the whole background, and for the longest time, no one knew just how far back it went and how detailed it was. That's why The Battle for Bond is such an important piece of James Bond reference material and has formed a gigantic chunk of all James Bond scholarship. The only trouble is it had some troubles of its own getting published, so the Thunderball Saga never ends, it seems. And so the first edition was actually banned due to it including some letters and correspondence of Fleming's, and that was really absolutely ridiculous. So you have to try to find the second edition that removed those, but was otherwise the same invaluable research. But that version quickly sold out. So that's what I have here is the slightly more common, slightly less expensive second edition, but it itself is extremely expensive on the used market. So this is the one James Bond reference work that is absolutely essential, but it's tough to get your hands on a copy of it. But honestly, I don't think any Bond fan can understand just how convoluted the development process was for Thunderball, and I don't think Bond fans can fully appreciate just how massive the Thunderball Saga really is until you read The Battle for Bond cover to cover. And it's so excellently put together and well researched and filled with insights and revelations not found anywhere else that you cannot put it down. The trouble is actually finding a copy to pick up and read in the first place. So it is very difficult to get. And that's why all of the scholarship and articles and research in the years since that have used it as a source is really where you find out about this information now. So you can actually read about the Thunderball Saga in greater detail, but everything is drawing its material and information from The Battle for Bond. So that brings us to the Thunderball novel, which was released by Johnathan in 1961. This is Fleming's 9th James Bond book, coming after For Your Eyes Only the previous year. And since this is coming from the Thunderball story drafts, screenplays, and treatments, one could view it as another sort of experiment, as For Your Eyes Only was a collection of short stories drawn from treatments and scripts for a James Bond TV series that was never made, and Fleming had said that after Goldfinger he was feeling creatively dry, and he would continue to experiment with the character and his writing until he really hit upon what is the last period of the novels, the ones that are aiming for more literary recognition and move further and further away from the classic blend of pulp adventure, action, and intrigue that made the original Bond novels so arresting. The novel has the plot we all know of James Bond having to go to the health clinic at Shrublands because he's not up to snuff as per his latest medical report. And this actually gets him stumbling onto the fringes of what is actually the grand criminal conspiracy of the secret organization Spectre to steal 2 atomic weapons from NATO forces and then hold the world ransom. This plot was strikingly original when it was first developed in the 1950s, and still by the early 60s was original and very threatening because it's something that could easily happen. It's something that could still easily happen, but it's also been done to death in fiction ever since in terms of all forms of media, so it doesn't have that freshness that it once had in the 1950s. Spectre actually manages to carry off their audacious scheme using the corrupted NATO observer to hijack a bomber and crash land it in the Bahamas, where the bombs are extracted by Emilio Largo and his men off of the Disco Volante underwater, and that also sets up the location of the story primarily being in the Bahamas and establishes the underwater themes throughout. Fleming's books, of course, had wonderful evocative usages of passages set underwater, but Thunderball having a consistent focus on water and the primary location being the Bahamas is something else that's drawn directly from the original story treatments and scripts. So this is a direct translation of everything that was done in those with McClory and Whittingham. Eventually, Bond starts investigating Emilio Largo and encounters Domino, who is the Bond heroine of this story, and Bond is still searching for the missing bomber and trying to find any sign of the bombs with the assistance of Felix Leiter, while agents across the globe are searching everywhere in a sort of mad panic to try and find the bombs before they have to pay up, before the due date for the ransom has arrived. And they have to do all of this in secret to avoid worldwide panic, of course. So this does establish a ticking clock, but the book never really has the reader feel that. It has a certain pace that is languid, and this also stems from issues in the original story development process. So everything that people have always criticized Thunderball for, how it moves, how it has a certain slowness, all the underwater sequences, all of this can be explained by going all the way back to the original development process. And again, you can't escape that this was designed and being written and developed in the 1950s for a film that never got made. So everything after that is watered down or changed or modified from that original concept, but you can't get away from how this story was originally created. Bond and Felix eventually find the bomber and start to catch on to Spectre's plan and Largo's operations in the Bahamas, and this sees Bond on the one hand try to win over Domino's affections to enlist her aid, but on the other sets up the final underwater climactic battle as Bond and Felix are given the usage of the new US atomic submarine, the Manta, and they are tracking the Spectre frogmen to actually attack them while actually transporting the bombs. That is deemed the best time to attack. So all the points of Thunderball are here. They never really crystallize into the traditional Fleming sweep that is so unique in the Bond books leading up to this. The term Fleming sweep was invented by fans and Bond scholars to describe the wonderful sense of pace that Fleming had in all of his James Bond novels. They move with a certain snap and energy, and some books have it more than others, and you get less and less of this as the books move further and further towards the final period of Fleming's writing style with the series in terms of the books that had the greater literary aspirations. Basically, the further they moved away from the pulp thriller aspects of the earlier books. Thunderball has moments in it in terms of the novel that are gripping and fascinating, and those are what you remember. none of them are the major plot highlights. Everything people know about Thunderball, the hijacking of the bombs, the Spectre organization, the plot, all that stuff, it feels secondary. Even the final underwater battle, which is much more desperate than how it is in the film adaptations. None of that really grips the reader. What grips the reader and what's most engaging, at least in my experience, is all of the small character moments, and this is what Fleming actually wrote that is unique to the novel. This is what gives the book its flavor, its texture. And so I think it's really unfair to call the book simply plagiarism, as there is quite a bit of material that is all Fleming, either taken from his original treatments that had stuff that was rejected or changed by McClory and Whittingham, or brand new material that he included in the novel to make the story work at novel length. So the opening at Shrublands with Bond on the health cure, all the little bits of business and the details, and meeting the characters of Dr. Wayne and, of course, Patricia Fearing, and Bond being miserable, having to drink the cups of black tea because, of course, Bond hates tea. He thinks it's mud. Basically having to detox himself from his martinis and the high living he's so used to. That is more engaging and memorable than actually some of the major plot points, like the hijacking of the bombs. And I think that underlines the problem with the novel, and why I think up to this point it is the weakest in the series compared to every book before it. It doesn't always fully have Fleming's writing voice. Frequently, like I said before, it feels like James Bond is kind of guest starring in somebody else's story. And that's because he kind of is, because Fleming is rewriting all of the material that he had worked on with others and putting his own spin on it. And him putting his own spin on it is the best part of the book. So it's those specific sections where we get character detail, and we get the little childish games between James Bond and Count Lippe at Shrublands, or the attempted assassination afterwards when Lippe tries to get Bond and it doesn't go so well. Most of all, I think Fleming completely overhauls the Domino character, and she is amazingly dimensional and shows all the traditional Fleming attributes that he would give to his Bond heroine. She is the classical bird with a wing down. She's the kept woman of Emilio Largo. She has a particular sense of guilt and repression that drives her to give this sort of cold front to everyone she encounters. She is psychologically complex, and more complex in ways than the Bond women up to this point in the literary series. And so when she starts opening up to Bond, there is actually a greater sense of a romantic connection between the two of them than we've seen in some past books. And in certain ways, I think this prefaces what we see eventually in On Her Majesty's Secret Service between Bond and Tracy, and eventually Bond marrying Tracy. I think Domino and her relationship with Bond in Thunderball, the novel, is that sort of midway point between the growing depth of the relationships and the Bond novels leading up to this point, and getting to Bond actually marrying someone by the end of OHMSS. And so I think the whole character of Domino is one of the key highlights of the novel. And one of the most memorable parts, once again, is not a major plot point. It's when Domino tells Bond the story of her hero. And her hero is, of course, the picture of the sailor on the packages of Players' cigarettes. And she gives this whole background story about how he was the first man I ever sinned with, and it tells so much about her character, her hopes and dreams that are long since forgotten and dashed, as she simply tells the story of how she became obsessed with this picture on a package of cigarettes, and how the picture even came to be licensed and used by the cigarette company in the first place. It has nothing to do with the plot, yet it is all about character, and it's one of the best passages Fleming ever wrote for a female character. it speaks volumes, and it explains later why Bond feels such guilt in essentially trying to bring Domino into working as a sort of side government agent. The book is still well written, but it feels like it's on rails. That's where it's always having to deal with the fact that it's coming from material that other people wrote for another medium, and so you've still got those vestiges of other voices. Understanding the Thunderball Saga explains why Thunderball, the novel, feels a certain way. And so the plot continues along with Fleming's usual evocative prose, but it feels diluted. It's never as arresting as the past books, 100%. But when you hit certain areas, such as Felix Leiter being reintroduced to the world of James Bond, suddenly the energy picks back up again. So I think the usage of the characters of Domino and Felix Leiter are great sort of linchpin moments to show where the energy picks back up again, and you've got more Fleming DNA in there. Another of the best passages of the book that I always remember has nothing to do with the plot. It's when Felix Leiter and Bond meet at the casino bar, and Felix goes on this long tirade about how they're being served watered-down martinis and calls the barman over and basically goes through how he just served them watered-down martinis, and Felix is kind of insulted by this and takes great delight in telling the barman how to actually do his job, and he should be able to tell the serious drinker from the other morons in the bar. That has nothing to do with the plot, and it's one of the best things in the book, just like the story about Domino's hero. And I think these moments explain what I'm talking about. The whole idea that reading Thunderball, you have all of these bursts of energy and creativity and character and world building, and then it has to just go back to the plot. You get that sense reading it that there's this slight disjointed feeling, and you may not be able to put your finger on it, but it all stems from the fact that this book is being written adapting the Thunderball scripts and story treatments. So even though Fleming is putting himself in there and adding all this new exclusive material, the overall product is still going to be limited because it's not 100% Fleming, or he didn't just go in like this was a novelization that he was rewriting from scratch. I mean, he was rewriting it from scratch, but he was also reverting to what had already been done between himself, Whittingham, and McClory. So it's got this back and forth feeling. The more you know about the Thunderball development, the more you'll be able to recognize this. And especially if you have the Battle for Bond and you can read the summaries of the script drafts and the treatments, it will really explain where certain pieces came from. This, of course, sees the introduction of Spectre and Ernst Stavro Blofeld into the literary Bond world, and Fleming does an amazing job of describing Spectre and setting up Blofeld as the supreme master villain, but they remain background figures as they only appear in certain moments of the book. Spectre itself seems to have been Fleming's concept, as McClory was very much fixated on having the Mafia as the villains. So this is one of the aspects where Fleming basically went back to his original ideas and developed them further. So I do think it was unfair to have McClory claiming rights to Spectre in the years afterwards. He was perfectly valid in claiming rights to the Thunderball story, but he himself didn't really come up with Spectre as an organization, and Fleming had a great love of the word Spectre as it appears multiple times in the past novels. The primary villain is, of course, Emilio Largo, who is a wonderful creation, and being Italian, I think, is sort of retaining that original concept of we want the villains to be the Mafia and to have all of them be Italians, obviously. So having the primary point man, the number 2 of the Spectre organization, be Italian, I think that's where you can see the vestiges of originally at some points the villains were the Mafia instead of Spectre. Largo has some elements of almost being a pirate captain because he's a very big imposing figure, and of course has the great Disco Volante and also leads his men personally throughout the story, and the whole book has the water theme of the original concept. So there is that wonderful sort of of piratical tinge, and he has the direct personal connection with Bond because Bond is directly challenging him, not just as agent versus villain, but he's attacking him on the human and emotional levels through Domino, and also one-upping him and bringing down his social stature by defeating him at the casino in front of everyone in all of Nassau high society, for example. So this fits in with past Bond villains in terms of the direct connection between Bond and Bond villain, and how Bond is continually trying to puncture the balloon of their sense of self-worth and trying to bring their ego down and trying to make them start to act sloppy or make mistakes. And Bond is also doing this to try and have Largo commit some error to show that he is indeed working for Spectre, because Bond is having to work as a detective in this story. So there is a lot of having to hunt around and Bond having to work with Felix looking for the plane. So there is that sense of Bond can't just act as gentleman agent extraordinaire as we've seen in the past books. There is some element of, not paperwork, but there's some element of having to do the regular ins and outs of the job of actually investigating things, which was always something that was more on the back burner in the previous Bond books. So that's another thing Thunderball inherits that also slows the pace down. There are also a number of coincidences in the story that are not great. First, you have the concept of the plane hijacker actually being Domino's brother, and that's fine, I suppose, but it is a little bit much to have Largo knowing and then disposing of the hijacker and not ever realizing that his mistress is actually directly related to the same guy. It's just explained away that Domino took on a stage name in the years past. That one is all right. It's still a little bit much, but it's at least explained away. The one that does kind of make the reader really scratch their head is why Bond is sent to Nassau in the first place. This is something that has actually crept up in other adaptations of Thunderball and was originally an issue in the original story treatments and scripts. In the book, Fleming has M act on a hunch that when the plane disappeared, it's possible that a slight radar echo indicated that it could have just turned south and maybe gone towards the Caribbean or the Bahamas. So he sends 007 to the Bahamas to investigate that area on a hunch, not for any particular reason. That it doesn't really hold up if you examine it closely, but at least Fleming gave a slight reason for it. This was something that was truly fixed in the 1965 film by having Bond actively make a connection between what was in the film, Francois Draval, and his sister Domino in the information packets. And it's stuff that also is linking back to things Bond already experienced, seeing the false Derval actually dead at Shrublands, and allows Bond's mind to always be working and for him to be an active character instead of a passive character. That was one of the great fixes and changes in the 1965 Thunderball script adaptation. So that was one thing they targeted and really fixed. That was a quirk and issue inherent to the original development. But that's the major coincidence in the Thunderball novel that is perhaps an even bigger slight issue to Domino being related to the plane hijacker. Overall, I do think Thunderball is a very good novel, but reading the books up to this point, you will feel that there is a difference. It's also got the sense of the feeling of malaise that's starting to emerge. Fleming was experiencing creative blocks and finding it more and more difficult to come up with new stories. As he would say, he was out of puff and zest. He also had increasing health issues and was actually very near to the end of his life. So it could be seen that a lot of those feelings of being older and feeling worn out and as if you were a sponge wrung dry and having this sense of malaise started to seep into the books. And Bond, of course, was an older character at this point. And all of this would grow exponentially in the final era of the books, particularly On Her Majesty's Secret Service and You Only Live Twice. So this is again growing further towards that point. And you could really start to feel this beginning, at least in Goldfinger, in terms of going through the novels in order. There's also a little bit of it in For Your Eyes Only. So I think that sort of theme growing, and that also tying in with Bond being out of shape in the opening and throughout the Shrubland sequence, I think this is building on a theme that Fleming had already been working on. I think that's another sign that there are significant amounts of original Fleming material and themes in the book that are in keeping with his other books. So again, that's why I have a real problem with people just writing off Thunderball the novel as plagiarism, because there is enough original Fleming material, and enough of that is directly in keeping with the themes he was developing and had already done and established in the early books, to make it part of his literary Bond series and separate it, at least in those areas, from the Thunderball story that had been developed in treatments and screenplays. The trouble is there's not enough of it. That's why I think Thunderball is a less effective book. It is a book I do enjoy rereading, but it is a book that I have always found just a little bit frustrating, because the moments that are really striking are the Fleming originals, or giving more detail to the characters, and we only get segments of that. The effectiveness is limited because those are only little highlights scattered throughout the book. And even in the ending, we have a moment that is in keeping with past books of Bond and the Bond heroine having their final sort of meeting, but at the end of Thunderball, they're a bruised and battered mess. So it's got the requisite Fleming ending, but that also feels a little bit rushed. It's short. And I think that's a sort of capsule version of all the wonderful bits of life that are scattered throughout the book that are pure Fleming. And had these been in an earlier book, or in a book that was not based on and directly adapting the work that he had done with Whittingham and McClory, the overall book would have been better, would have been more consistent, and have more of the energy and snap of the existing James Bond novels. Ultimately, I think Thunderball is a great book, but it is a compromised book. I think compromised is the best way to describe it when you're discussing it. Some fans really love it, or have it among their favorite novels in the series. But I think when you read through the books, regardless of how much background you may have with the literary James Bond, I think you can always feel that something is a little bit off, or there are other voices in terms of the writing. There's elements where it doesn't quite feel like it's something Fleming would have done exactly in that way. He's having to adapt something that's pre-existing. And that's why the things that you take away from the book and the moments you remember are all the small, wonderfully evocative Fleming moments. I think if you do look at the main plot of the book and how it plays out, it also suggests what that 1950s or early 60s Thunderball film might have been like. It's a little bit on the drier side, and so once you take out Fleming's beautiful prose and you're just looking at the plotting and the story and how it plays out, it suggests what that film might have been like. And you just have to imagine it in the confines of, say, a 2-hour film in 1959 or 1960. So that film obviously would not have had the snap and energy of Fleming's novels, and it wouldn't have the snap and energy of the iconic Eon series either. It would have been its own thing, having elements of both of those, but the mixture may not have come out quite right. That's the sort of best way you can look at what the Thunderball film, had it actually gotten made, would have turned out like. And you have to then think, it would have been a hope of everyone that it had been successful, but it may not have been the necessary foundation to launch a whole successful series afterwards. Now to turn to adaptations of Thunderball, first I'll talk about the 1961 Daily Express newspaper strip adaptation. And this one is really notable because it is completely different from all the other strip adaptations. Fleming had a deal with the Daily Express, and it was supposed to be a sort of exclusive deal for adapting James Bond material. But the owner of the Daily Express was not pleased when Fleming made a deal with the Sunday Times to publish the Living Daylights short story. This was viewed as a sort of break in their contract, and so the Daily Express very quickly terminated their ongoing Thunderball strip. So when you're looking at the strips, they're breaking up the story into a daily syndicated strip where you have 3 to 4 panels, sometimes more on Sundays, telling the story. They're not exactly designed to be read all at once, but if you do that or you read all of them, you get the whole story broken down into wonderful comic sections. So here in Thunderball, you have the adaptation once again by Henry Gamage, and we have the amazing, iconic John McCluskey artwork featuring his version of James Bond, which was the first sort of visual standard the general public had for 007. You have the full detailed breakdown of the opening sequence and Bond being sent to Shrublands and the setting up of Spectre's plot. This gets all the way to the actual hijacking of the bomber and crashing it in the Bahamas so Spectre can get the bombs. Or I should say, it leads up to the crashing of the plane, because all of a sudden, if you're looking at this, these are the last 2 pages of the entire strip. We go from Giuseppe Patacci actually bringing the bomber down to suddenly Bond and Felix looking for the bomber and finding it, and then we rush through the last bit of the story with the underwater battle just barely glimpsed, and it's suddenly over. That is because of the owner's feelings towards Fleming basically breaking their agreement, and so they just rush through the rest of the Thunderball story, so technically it is done and over with, and as you can see, it's in the space of just a couple strips. So the Thunderball newspaper strip only has the opening, third of the story, and then it rushes through everything else. We never really meet Largo. We never see Domino. The underwater battle is over in a single panel. It's really bizarre reading this because it's like you're watching the Thunderball film and, 30 minutes in, you just suddenly hit the fast forward button, except you hit it multiple times. Or, really, it's more like you're just chapter skipping through the rest of the film. That's what this feels like. And then you just let the last, 3 minutes play out. It's truly bizarre, and it's all because of this disagreement. They would eventually settle things, and the series would resume with an adaptation of Her Majesty's Secret Service. But Thunderball remains the one novel that was, shall we say, extraordinarily abridged in its newspaper strip adaptation. Now to talk about the film adaptations, before discussing the 1965 Thunderball, I think it's important to look at the original 1961 Richard Maibaum script written for Eon and what was to have been the basis of the first Eon film, but it was eventually shelved due to the court case, and then they realized they really didn't have the money to make Thunderball as the first film. Now, there is a version of the Maibaum 1961 script floating around. It is unfortunately incomplete, so that's the version I've read, and then there are also some wonderful summaries as well, which I'll link to in the description. But when you look at this script, even though it's 1961 and there is no James Bond formula yet, and the Eon series is just in the first stages, I think this script already shows the elements Richard Maibaum brought to the series, and why I personally think he is the most important of the key creative team members that made up the core James Bond team. Because looking at this screenplay, even though it's obviously Thunderball, and it's obviously adapting the Fleming novel, and thus all of the 1950s treatments and screenplays and things, it is remarkably a bit more modern than what you can read about the McClory Whittingham Fleming material. It doesn't feel as locked to the 1950s as even the Thunderball book does. It basically refines and enhances everything that exists in Thunderball and moves it closer to what we eventually see in the 1965 film. It is still very faithful to the Fleming novel, perhaps to a fault, and this was basically just like a first draft, I suppose. I don't think it got past a certain point. And again, the version I read is incomplete, so I can't really judge it fully. But reading this, I think, is the first time you get the sense of the cinematic James Bond appearing. From the first appearance of 007 in this script, it feels like the classical cinematic Eon James Bond. It's not all fully there yet, but this is the first spark of it, and I think it's because Maibaum wrote it, and he was the key creative voice of James Bond in the films 13 out of 16 times in terms of the first 16 films. So obviously he had a lot to do with creating the cinematic James Bond tone. That's here in this 1961 script, even at this early stage. So I personally think this is one of the most invaluable James Bond drafts that survives and shows the beginnings of the adaptation work that was done and finished in the 1965 film. Because when they got around to actually making Thunderball, they wound up going back to the 1961 material that they had to just leave. But then they had to retrofit it and reshape it and make it work with the James Bond formula they had established, because this was coming after Goldfinger. And they would have to also tailor the script for the Sean Connery James Bond persona. But all of that can actually be first glimpsed in this 1961 script draft. So I think it is absolutely crucial to study. And with the notion of James Bond Day happening every year being tied to the release date of Dr. No, I think if you really wanted to have a James Bond Day and link it to the birth of the cinematic series, you could do the release date of Dr. No. You could do the original date of the signing of the contract between Fleming and what became Eon Productions with Broccoli and Saltzman, or the agreeing on the United Artists deal. But if you wanted to find the exact point creatively where the cinematic James Bond was first born, it is Richard Maibaum's 1961 Thunderball script. It is absolutely crucial for understanding how the cinematic James Bond began, even though this is still a direct adaptation of Thunderball as it was in Fleming's novel, and it was never fully completed and realized. But everything Maibaum did here informed where they went in the scripts on Dr. No, and everything Maibaum did here informed the eventual 1965 film script. So now let's talk about the fourth Eon film, Thunderball, released in 1965, produced by Kevin McClory. That was the credit he was given, but essentially executive produced by Broccoli and Saltzman. This was allowing McClory to use his rights to make Thunderball as a film, but partnering with Eon meant that he could have Sean Connery as James Bond and have it part of the official series, because he couldn't get approval or financing or anyone to back him doing what would have been a rival film production. So he made a deal with Eon, whereas Charles K. Feldman didn't, and eventually made the Casino Royale spoof in 1967 as a rival production. What Eon had feared McClory would do with Thunderball in 1965. McClory did have some input into the film, but it really seems more limited and more of him being an on-location production supervisor and voice during the shoot in the Bahamas, because that was his real base of locations, and it was his baby of trying to make the Bahamas a viable shooting location for films in general and to build up the film industry in the Bahamas, plus having the big spectacle of a big underwater film, even though the Eon film was not shot in a large format system, nor was it a roadshow film. It was basically everything McClory had wanted to do and everything Thunderball had become fit within the confines of the James Bond formula, coming after what had been established with Goldfinger. So it is the Eon version of Thunderball, as good as they could make it in 1965, with the added pressure of the entire world looking in on the production, because Goldfinger had taken the world by storm and started Bond mania, and 1965 was the height of the spy craze in terms of all the imitators and other spy fiction in all forms of media. And so Thunderball was the most eagerly anticipated film in existence at the time. time. So the film unfortunately suffers from that in terms of the notion of it having everything and the kitchen sink, which is even a line thrown into the film. And despite bringing back director Terrence Young and returning to the sense of realism and urgency along with sensuality of the first two James Bond films, it's a much bigger film and has a more gargantuan scope, and so James Bond as a character is less focused on, and once again, as in all versions of Thunderball, starts to feel a little bit like a guest star in someone else's story. There's also the inherent issues with the plot in terms of there being a lot of repetition and having to play detective, searching for the bombs, and allowing the larger-than-life elements while they're there. They are a bit removed from the plot. And so, like the novel, there are certain things everybody remembers, but the overall film has a certain feeling of slowness to it. And this always gets attributed to the film having all these underwater sequences, and obviously moving underwater is much slower. But I don't think that's actually true. I think the reason why people feel the film is slow is actually the issues inherent to how the film was originally developed in the first place in the 1950s. These were issues back then, if you read about the treatments and the screenplays, and they're actually the elements that date the story. And so the 1965 film does improve quite a lot of things, particularly in the screenplay, but it itself is adapting what Richard Maibaum did in 1961, adapting what Fleming did, which was adapting the story treatments and screenplays, which were adapting the original Fleming treatments, which were adapting the original concept and ideas. So there was less opportunity to have original thought because it's an adaptation of an adaptation of an adaptation of an adaptation. So it's very convoluted trying to recognize and study how all this grew and developed, because the Eon film is credited to Richard Maibaum and John Hopkins, who was brought on primarily by Harry Saltzman to rewrite and do an additional draft, actually somewhat during production as well, to what Maibaum had done, updating his 1961 material. And then I'm sure Maibaum probably did some additional work after that. So there's other voices and writers in the Thunderball film on top of all of the other voices that had been and versions that had been. And I think this is what ultimately does limit the overall effectiveness of the film. As much as I think the film is a masterpiece, and as much as I think it is unfairly criticized, you can't escape the inherent issues that are linked to how the story was developed in the first place. Fleming couldn't escape that in his novel. Maibaum couldn't escape that in the 1961 script. And they couldn't escape it here in the 1965 film, nor could they escape it in 1983 with Never Say Never Again. So there are inherent quirks and issues to Thunderball, but the film is also showing where Bond became more about spectacle and less about the stories and the characters, and maintaining that snap and drive of the first three films, which are the films closest to the snap and drive of Fleming's best novels. This would increase further in the next film, You Only Live Twice, where the spectacle unfortunately overwhelms the story. It's threatening to in Thunderball due to the height of the spy craze and having an increased budget and then inheriting all the issues of the Thunderball story. But You Only Live Twice is where these issues fully take over, and notably, it's the only film of the 1960s Bond films to not have any involvement from Richard Maibaum, and it shows. As much as I love You Only Live Twice, it's a different kind of film, and James Bond is even less important in that film than he is as a lead character in Thunderball. The film does recognize, I think, the great bits that Fleming added to his novel, and it does run with the elements of the overall Thunderball story that are so striking. I think it is the great underwater film. I don't think any film compares in terms of how water is used and made to feel so larger than life. It has all of the key production members return and outdo themselves. Notably, Ken Adam returns to create just show-stopping sets. John Steers returns and won an Oscar for his effects work. Norman Wanstall's sound effects are even more detailed. Peter Hunt returns to edit the film and had a gargantuan task of dealing with this massive film and having to meet a certain release date, and actually got the date extended to Christmas 1965. So he's having to also fight in the edit against the inherent issues with the Thunderball story and the pacing, and alter his revolutionary cutting style of the first three films to try and make all of this work. But you do at least have the return of Terrence Young, who brings that serious espionage flavor back, but it's not fully there because Eon had changed by that point. With the success of Goldfinger, it was no longer the sort of special secret club of people trying with an unproven property that it was with the first two films, where they hadn't taken the world by storm yet. So even with Young coming back, there was already friction between key collaborative members, and Sean Connery was becoming more and more disillusioned with the intensive focus of the entire world press and his stardom being pretty much everywhere. And this would come to a point on You Only Live Twice when he would leave the series. He felt like he wasn't being adequately taken care of given the intensive scrutiny and the increasing scope and scale of the films dominating his creative life. So you can start to see various seams in the Eon world starting to really get formed here. And you can also tell that this is the film after the big breakthrough in Goldfinger becoming a phenomenon. So there's naturally some fall off after that. And I think all of this comes together to make Thunderball a really unique film experience. It is an enormous film in scope and scale, but it does lose a little bit of that magic spark of the first three films, while also inheriting all of the Thunderball Saga in terms of its storytelling and plotting. But the script does make some really impressive changes and some strengthening of the narrative that is better than any other version of Thunderball. So in terms of all the Thunderball iterations that are out there, the 1965 film is the strongest and most effective. The villains and Spectre are actually more effective, especially Largo, but it retains the direct personal challenge between him and Bond by having Domino in the middle of this love triangle of sorts. And Domino does retain some of the introspection and depth that Fleming gave her in the novel, just unfortunately, some of that is thrown out due to it being a film, and in the translation process, that typically does go out the window a bit. But we at least have more of it left than what usually is there. And that's why Domino is one of the great Bond women of the film series. It's also, I think, arguably the most sensual of the original films, because the Terrence Young films really have that in spades, and none of the other directors really had that same knack. And Thunderball has the largest and greatest cast of beautiful women, and of course the immortal Fiona Volpe, who is the fullest realization of the necessary henchman of Spectre and other love interests that actually was kind of lacking in all the other versions of Thunderball. I think the Fiona character is perhaps the 1965 version's greatest realization of certain elements that were kind of there in the earlier versions of Thunderball, but needed further refinement. So adding Fiona in there, and combined with Luciano Paluzzi's amazing performance, it adds energy and spark to the film. And that's why once she's gone, a lot of that energy does drop out, and it takes a while to build back up. It's basically the underwater climax that brings everything back together again. Ultimately, the 1965 Eon film version of Thunderball has to be examined with the historical context in mind, as to just look at it as a standalone film today, especially when you're just watching the Bond films at home. You don't necessarily get the same sense of grandeur and spectacle that it originally had during the peak of Bond mania at the height of the spy craze in the 60s. You also won't won't be able to fully appreciate two of the unique aspects of the Thunderball film that make it such a spectacular experience of grandeur. And those are, of course, it being the first James Bond film in the scope aspect ratio, so the first anamorphic James Bond film, as compared to the spherical first three films, and that set the new standard for the Bond films, which continued for most of the original series, with the exceptions of Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. So Ted Moore's incredible photography shows off the grandeur of the film and more of the incredible budget increase they had had even after Goldfinger. But the others, of course, John Barry's just immortal score. It's one of his masterpieces, and really the first time he scores not what is just a James Bond film, but a James Bond epic. It's still arguably the best of his James Bond scores, and that says quite a lot. It is truly one of the great film scores of all time, and perfectly highlights all the themes of the story, and is able to carry the action all the way through, in addition to finding the perfect way to score all of the underwater sequences and convey the sense of spectacle that Kevin McClory had in his head for making this big super production all the way back at the start of the Thunderball Saga. However, if the Bond fan of today doesn't know anything about the overall Thunderball Saga and how this project even came to be, they may feel that the film is a little bit slow in areas and just chalk it up to the usual complaint of it's because of the underwater sections, and that is unfortunately not true. In order to fully appreciate the fourth Eon James Bond film, you really do have to have some idea of the world in which it was released of 1965, but especially to fully appreciate the story and the adaptation, you have to know something about the Thunderball story process, whether you've read Fleming's novel or you at least need to know a little bit about how all of this developed and went through multiple incarnations before we got to the really impressive film adaptation. Of course, we're not done with Thunderball, because the Thunderball Saga, and I should say the Kevin McClory Saga, continued, as exactly almost to the date 10 years later in 1975, Kevin McClory reappeared with his ability to make Thunderball again and announced that's exactly what he was going to do. This eventually culminated in the Warhead project with Sean Connery and Lynn Dayton. They did have a finished screenplay and they were shopping it around trying to get a film made, and it was also coming up against the forthcoming The Spy Who Loved Me, which led to McClory claiming the eventual drafts of Spy were taking elements of Thunderball and Spectre and also his Warhead script, so Eon made some changes to Spy to just avoid any of that. The primary one being removing any usage of Spectre and Blofeld and any certain elements that might be considered as inadvertently similar to the Warhead script. That script is actually quite famous among those of us who enjoy reading screenplays and drafts of films that never got made or were vastly different in the final release version, as you have Sean Connery himself involved in the writing, and Lynn Dayton is one of the great espionage spy fiction writers of all time. So you have these unique voices involved in this, which is otherwise just another version of Thunderball. And just reading about the script, you see all sorts of details that seem completely bonkers. This is where there are robot hammerhead sharks and Bond going in the New York sewers, and there's alligators, and a final sequence at the Statue of Liberty, and secret underwater bases, and all sorts of other things that seem way over the top. And to do this as a film in the 1970s would have required at least an astronomical budget. It's far even beyond the scale in certain areas than the amazing sets of Ken Adam on The Spy Who Loved Me and the building of the 007 stage. I don't necessarily think this version of Warhead would have worked, because on one hand it was over the top in areas, which is actually kind of surprising given that Lynn Dayton is known for his unnamed spy thrillers, which of course were turned by Harry Saltzman into the masterpiece Harry Palmer films, which were all about being the adventures of a grounded spy who was as anti-James Bond as possible. And of course, Sean Connery preferred the style of what Terence Young did on the first two James Bond films, which were much more serious and down-to-earth and devoted to telling Fleming's espionage stories. So for Warhead to have so many over-the-top elements seems kind of strange. It does lean into I mean, not science fiction, but there are science fiction elements that start to appear. So I don't know if it would have necessarily gotten made in that exact form, or if it would have worked, because at its core, it's still technically having to be a Thunderball remake. But famously, Warhead would not come to fruition, and this script just went by the wayside. Eon and McClory would continue to have on and off legal dealings and wranglings over the years, and eventually McClory would partner with Jack Schwartzman, who is a lawyer turned producer, who figured out exactly how McClory could indeed make a new James Bond film, and that was to essentially remake Thunderball directly, and so that led to 1983's Never Say Never Again. This film is compromised because it is having to tiptoe around the fact that it has to be a Thunderball remake, and if they strayed too far or did anything that was really part of the Eon films, they could get their pantsuit off immediately. So that was one constraint. The other was the luring of Sean Connery back to the role with a large payday and creative input, and also input in terms of the production. And so you had the return of the sense of Connery was going to be able to have creative input on the front end, like he was in the script development on the Warhead project. All of this seems sound. It would just be another Thunderball remake, but unfortunately, the scripting process didn't go so well. They changed writers rather late into the production and threw out a lot of what Lorenzo Semple Jr. had done, and also lost a lot of the original concepts of what Connery wanted to do in terms of playing an older James Bond who is maybe a little bit over the hill, and then playing with those concepts to give him something new to approach in the role, to basically pick up where he had left off, but all these years later, and what would that mean for his character in 1983 in a completely different world. The film injects comedy, which does help some areas, but it can't overcome the fact that the production became a big muddled mess, and things were not helped by Schwartzman being an inexperienced producer, and also having to constantly deal with potential legal threats from Eon for the film being too close to their copyrighted James Bond series material, which means, of course, Never Say Never Again does not benefit from what the 1965 Thunderball did, and having all of the production team members, having the gun barrel, having the James Bond theme, having a John Barry score, all the iconography is locked to the Eon series. But the idea of having another James Bond film that went in a different area, it could have worked. It would have worked, especially had they mined more from the literary James Bond and gone after things that were not really done in the Eon series, but they would be limited in what they could use, because then Eon could say that, as they own the rights to those books, you can't use anything specific. So it did put major limitations on the film. But the production did not go very well, and the eventual result is the 1983 film that was released in direct competition with the Eon film that year, Octopussy, which led to the Battle of the Bonds, as the press called it, between the official film starring Roger Moore and the offshoot film released by Warner Brothers eventually, starring Sean Connery returning to the role. The strongest parts of the film are where it differs from the Thunderball concept, and they're limited in what they can do. So this is essentially Connery's performance as Bond, playing with the character being older and what that means. What they do with some of the side characters, such as M and Q, turning them into variations of the standard version, although Q is really an invention of the Eon film series, so I'm surprised they got away with having any version of that character in the film. And then, of course, you have the new rendition of Largo, who is a completely different character in terms of his psychological makeup, and is brilliantly performed by Klaus Maria Brandauer, who is, along with Connery, the best thing about the film. In fact, this version of Largo is so fascinating, you wish there was more with this character. He's now a multimillionaire industrialist. He's still the operative of Spectre. They're still stealing bombs. It's just tweaked to be modern for the 1980s. And unfortunately, the modernization attempts date the film far more than the original 1965 Eon film. So Thunderball from 1965 remains timeless, whereas Never Say Never Again is hard locked to 1983 and you cannot escape it. The best scenes in the film are either with Connery or Brandauer or their handful of confrontations. And the single best scene in the film is their confrontation in the casino, which has now been updated to the game of Largo's own invention, Domination, that they play, which of course is also picking up on the arcade craze and the emergence of the video game market. That's the one element of trying to be futuristic that actually works in the film because it fits the time, and it's a really well-designed sequence because it's all about the psychological play between Bond and Largo, and you learn a ton about Largo's character makeup because the game is of his own design, and Bond has to figure out how to play him and beat him at his own game, and outmaneuver Largo, but also outwit him, and of course publicly humiliate him. This takes the place of playing Baccarat or Chemin de Fer. Everything else is essentially a translation of everything that was already in the Thunderball story, the Thunderball novel, and the 1965 film. It's just translated here, and none of it is really as good. Typically, most people point to Barbara Carrera stealing the show as Fatima Blush, which is the updated version of Fiona Volpe, and actually the Fatima name goes back to one that Fleming came up with during the overall Thunderball process. Carrera, like Paluzzi in the 1965 Thunderball, is a great dose of energy the film badly needs, and once she's gone, the film suffers for it. However, her character doesn't really have any surprises because she's forming the same function because she's basically the same character, and the characterization is allowed to get more into the cartoonish over-the-top world, and that sticks out in the world of James Bond. It's still a highlight of the film, but I've never been as big of a fan of the rendering of the Fatima character in Never Say Never Again as compared to the unbelievably striking Fiona Volpe in Thunderball, who was all the more chilling and effective because she is so good at what she does and she enjoys what she does, but she's very professional about it. In fact, she's as good as, if not better than Bond in certain areas, and is able to sleep with him as Bond would sleep with a woman in a story, and then throw it right back at him coldly and professionally exactly as Bond would. And so in one of the only times in the series, Bond himself is used and beaten at that time. You don't get that predicament or that level of predicament and Bond being defeated in Never Say Never Again. It's another sign of the remake being inferior dramatically. That's not to say there aren't highlights, and I do enjoy things in the film, but it's a film you have to acclimatize to because at the end of the day, it's Thunderball over again, except everything is worse or not as refined, and the plot is not as tight, and the production troubles really are reflected in every aspect of the film. And so ultimately, you're coming to it for certain aspects, but you can't escape that it's Thunderball once again, and the issues that were part of the original story back in the 1950s are still a problem in 1983, and they're magnified and added to because even when other writers were brought in, they didn't have time to fix everything, nor could they start from scratch, and the film was still being rewritten while it was shot, and it added to an overall release that was compromised from the start, and the compromises really compounded upon themselves. So it's really a miracle the film got finished and is as good as it is and has enough little iconic moments or flashes of the Connery Bond charm to make it stand on its own 2 feet. So it's a film you have to come to with some knowledge of what led up to it. As a standalone film, it's perhaps okay, but it is forever held down by the issues surrounding it and from the compromised production, resulting in, unfortunately, a compromised film. One would think that McClory would finally be satisfied that he had made his own James Bond film, but after the release of Never Say Never Again, which was relatively successful, although it was less successful than Octopussy that year, Kevin McClory continued to try to use his James Bond rights to a single story and would later announce in the years afterwards and also the decades afterwards that he would be doing another James Bond film, and they were typically referred to as Warhead along with the year, so Warhead 90, and then there was even eventually a Warhead 2000 AD. Some of these had various Bond actors attached. At one point, he was trying to get Pierce Brosnan to star in his rival Bond film after the famous Remington Steele incident. So that was potentially a McClory production that could have been. And then there were points later where Timothy Dalton was supposedly being approached for a McClory rival production. But ultimately, McClory was never able to make another version of Thunderball, and eventually the rights would get back to MGM and Eon after Sony made their deal with MGM to swap rights for Spider-Man rights. Then in 2016, as part of their continuing series, the BBC produced a 90-minute radio drama adaptation of Fleming's Thunderball novel. This sees the return of Toby Stephens playing James Bond and the rest of the supporting cast continuing, but having Tom Conti play Largo and Alfred Molina as Blofeld. This has all the pluses and minuses of what I've discussed in the other BBC radio adaptations. It's having to squeeze down an entire novel into 90 minutes and, of course, is audio only, so there has to be more exposition and dialogue to explain things to the listener, as you don't have the benefit of having text or any visuals. It is an impressive effort overall and a good listen. You'll be able to enjoy the Thunderball story, even if you've never read the book or seen any of the films. So the spirit of Fleming's novel is here. With one exception, I think the performances and characterizations are on point, and my criticisms would only be, as I've said with most of the others, you do lose something from having to translate everything to audio only and squeeze it down to 90 minutes. Some of the things they try are not the greatest adaptation choice. There's an occasional flourish of trying to add a little extra humor that feels maybe a little bit forced, and sometimes in the opening act the structure is a little bit altered to move scenes around in order to try and make it flow a bit better in the world of audio drama. So you can understand why they did these things. It's just part of the adaptation process. It will be up to the Bond fan listening to determine whether they like the direction taken or not. So overall, I think it's a solid, very well done adaptation, and I enjoy hearing Toby Stephens' approach to playing Bond in the world of audio. Unfortunately, though, this is another one of the radio adaptations that I think does an extreme disservice to one of Fleming's villains. In some of the radio dramas to this point, as close as the adaptations are to the books, there are some that take a very odd approach in how they characterize the villains, and also how the voices sound, and thus the whole characterization is altered. Here with Largo, Tom Conti is, of course, of Italian ancestry, so that fits. It's almost as if he's directed to play Largo with more of the sort of a flair of an unfortunate sort of Italian stereotype you used to see in all sorts of classic films. It might just be that Largo is sort of putting on a front and acting for everyone in Nassau, but when you hear this, it is a bit jarring because the voice and the mannerisms are so pronounced that it just sort of screams stereotypical Italian character, and it doesn't fit with the Largo that I have in my head when I'm reading Thunderball, nor does it fit with Adolfo Celli's masterful performance in the 1965 film with Robert Rietti doing the voice dub. It just doesn't work for me at all, and that's the one major drawback of the radio adaptation is, again, I think you have some choices made in the characterization of the villain. It's not the performance, really. It's the direction and the approach the adaptation takes, and then how the overall effect is. I don't think it's as bad as what was done with Seraphimo Spang or Dr. No, but it's getting up there. And the first time you hear Largo actually speak, it does throw you because it just sounds so out of character. However, outside of that, I do think it is a very good adaptation. It does have to leave out a lot because it is squeezing it down to under 90 minutes, but it is a fun and interesting listen if you've not tried any of these radio dramas, just to see how they adapted Fleming's prose to audio. Now to discuss the various editions and cover artwork designs for the Thunderball novel over the years. The first is, of course, the iconic UK first edition from Johnathan Cape, released in 1961 with Richard Chopping's astounding painted cover. This features a highly detailed image of a skeleton hand reaching for cards on the green felt with a knife already stabbed through the cards. And in the background, you can see the expected sort of stencil-looking credit with the novel's title, and then Fleming's credit is arranged perpendicular, and you've got the skeleton arm actually interrupting it, which is a nice touch. And the credits are on a sort of wood grain background, as in keeping with Chopping's other covers. While this singular image is not necessarily indicating the plot of Thunderball, it is so staggering as a work of art and so intricately detailed and visually arresting that you see it and you have to know what it is. It draws the eye immediately, and it's just a brilliant piece of art, even if it doesn't necessarily suggest the Thunderball story. The only connections one could make, I suppose, are the cards suggesting the meeting of Bond and Largo in the casino, the skeleton representing the fact that the whole world is at stake and so many people could die or be killed, whereas Bond risking death as always, and the knife representing the threat of Spectre, perhaps, with the point hitting the Queen of Diamonds. That could perhaps be referring to Domino with the Ace of Spades under it, maybe referring to Bond. I don't know. I'm just trying to draw connections because I've always wondered exactly how this was supposed to tie into the Thunderball story. But regardless of that, it is the definitive cover for the book because, again, Richard Chopping returns to create an astounding piece of art that becomes the standard image we carry in our heads for one of Fleming's novels. And I think this is another of the great book covers of all time. So with all that said, when it came time for the US first edition hardcover release by the Viking Press, did they reuse Richard Chopping's cover as had been done on the past couple of books? Of course they didn't. They went for a unique cover image, as some of the US editions did, and this one at least is depicting elements of the plot and themes of the story, but it's also indistinct and you wouldn't exactly know what it was until you read the book and found out what the plot was. It's also far less visually arresting than Richard Chopping's amazing UK artwork. So you really have to examine the US cover for its own merits. It does have the flavor of more of a pulpy paperback. We do have the Disco Volante speeding on the bottom. We've got it having its searchlights on, so it's at night. But in the night sky, you see what looks like a swirling explosion mixing orange and purple. It's either the bomber coming in to crash land, but one can only assume it's probably one of the bombs exploding, perhaps, is supposed to be what's being indicated. And you have the Thunderball credit and Fleming's name right in the sort of center of the swirling explosion. So it is a nice looking cover. It makes sense why this was generated, and it does fit the book, but it's also a little bit understated, which almost makes it have a slight generic flavor to it. At least that's how I feel about it. I think it's a good cover, and I do like that some of the US editions actually have unique first edition covers, but this one is just, I think, a bit too understated, and especially when compared to the astounding UK artwork, it just does not compare. In 1962, there was a UK book club edition in hardcover that once again had unique artwork, as the other club editions had. This nicely gives us an underwater scene. It looks like Bond in scuba gear, but we have the return of the skeleton hand, and this is nicely sticking up from the ocean floor in the foreground. And you've got the fish swimming around, and it's got all the right ominous notes, and it's got the flavor of pulp adventure. The title with Fleming's credits on the top. The font does look a little bit plain, but overall, I think this is a really good cover. I love what they were going for. I think the depiction and the detail is great, and the composition is wonderful. It's just, again, just a tiny bit on the plain side, especially since the ending of Thunderball features the underwater battle between Bond Felix and the sailors from the Manta versus all of the Spectre agents and Largo with the bombs in the middle of it. So one would think that if you did an underwater scene, you would actually depict the underwater battle on the cover. Still, I think this is a highly effective cover. I don't think it's talked about enough, so I think this is possibly the most underrated cover for the book. I think due to the court case surrounding the book and then the launch of the Eon films and also a lot of the publishers in the US and UK sort of switching up their Bond releasing patterns and starting new styles meant that we didn't see a Thunderball paperback for at least a little bit. So in 1963, we saw the first British paperback in the Pan series, famous in the mid-60s for featuring the bold black James Bond on the top, and then the covers having a singular object or item on a stark colored background. Here you see bullet holes in what at first looks like it's perhaps sand or just something brown, until you start noticing the wrinkles and the pores and you realize that this is indeed flesh. So it seems to be someone's back. But it's also, in the bullet holes, got the effect of as if it's torn through paper, as if the book itself has been shot through. So it's a really interesting design. I don't know if it necessarily translates on first glance in terms of getting all of that across, but it is one of the really attention-grabbing covers in this series. I don't know if it necessarily is conveying the book inside, but it is certainly attention grabbing. The 60s Signet edition in the US was done as part of their iconic James Bond thriller series with the matching covers and style to fit with the other books. So this goes with a sort of off blue, almost a sort of purple tinged blue to suggest the underwater theme, and Barry Phillips' iconic artwork, which is tucked between Fleming's credit and the title, is showing Domino and her blonde hair flowing in the water, and then a frogman behind her, or it's possibly Bond himself, and we get a little bit of the marine life. And what's nice is that what's supposed to be the water in the image blends in perfectly with the rest of the color background, and the rest is in the iconic Signet style. So I think this is another of the book's great covers, and it's one of the notable Signets because the artwork nicely blends into the overall cover background. Both Pan and Signet would come out with their own movie tie-in editions in 1965. Pan would go with this sort of approach of a collage of stills from the production. So you've got shots of the actors and shots of the underwater battle as little photo strips sort of stacked on top of one another. So it's a good overall design. It just maybe looks more at first glance like a making of book cover than the actual novel. The Signet edition is done in the James Bond thriller style and form, but this time they use the actual poster artwork or part of the iconic marketing campaign, because they've taken a section of the iconic Robert McGuinness painting of Bond with beautiful women scattered around, which was done for a variety of posters, but they've taken a section of it and reshaped it to fit inside the front cover. So you're losing a bit of the art on the left, but it's expanded, so Fleming's credit is tweaked, and you have red text for the Thunderball title to match more of what was used for the film promotion, and you've got the classic 007 logo added on. But you've still got Signet's credit and a James Bond thriller down the side, so this makes one of the really nice movie tie-in editions that was still conformed to the existing Signet paperbacks. Later editions of the original Signet paperback would, of course, add the 007 7-page logo in the corner. That's how you distinguish early copies from later ones. And I think once the film had been out, Signet just reverted to the updated 007 logo version of the original blue cover. In 1974, Pan brought out the paperback in what is typically called their sort of still life series, where you have these incredible collages of items directly taken from the book and the plot. So here we have what looks like some scuba gear. We have a shattered diving mask to suggest the underwater battle at the end. We have a pistol in a stage of disassembly with a watch coming through it. We've got what looks like a martini glass as well, and a little photograph that is perhaps supposed to be referencing Domino. So you have enough of the iconography of certain moments of Thunderball, and all of these covers had a lot of care put into them. It's really fun to stare at these and try to figure out exactly what item is what, and basically play a game of I Spy, trying to find all the little elements in these wonderfully staged photographs. In 1978, Triad Panther released a version of Thunderball. This is part of their Girls on Guns series, as you clearly have a beautiful woman draped on a gigantic gold-plated automatic. This doesn't really have anything to do with Thunderball unless you were trying to say that the woman on the cover is perhaps Domino or another character in the story. All of the covers in this series would just have the gun in a different position and a different woman draped across it. It is attention grabbing, obviously, but it really doesn't suggest the story of Thunderball. In the US, we finally saw another paperback release by Berkley as part of their reissues of Fleming novels to tie in with the ongoing success of the John Gardner continuation novels. So by 1985, they did a version of Thunderball, which is in the same general format with the credit of Ian Fleming's Master Spy, James Bond, and then having a silhouetted figure on the bottom in a particular gun pose. Here, they've gone with a really bold orange background with Bond in blue, and then the title in a sort of red. And so this does grab the eye, but it means that it takes a second to actually distinguish the Thunderball title from the orange background. It does look better in person than seeing images online, but I like what they were going for, and I still enjoy this overall design aesthetic because it is what I grew up with for the John Gardner books, and some of these editions were how I first read Fleming novels. They didn't reprint all of Fleming's novels, but these are interesting versions to have if you are a fan of the cover art design, and the typeface is reset and the easier read style of the Gardner paperbacks of this time. So you could build a matching set of Fleming and Gardner paperbacks from Berkley for everything that they did release. In 1989, Coronet Books released Thunderball as part of their series of James Bond reissues, with the unfortunate sort of generic approach that I think mars these. Once again, you have a standard James Bond credit and a standard Fleming credit that's the same, except Fleming's credit and the title is within its own box, and then each book would have just different colors. You also, again, have a silhouetted figure like the Berkley paperbacks, which would be different on each book. Except with the Coronet books, they just come across as more generic than the Berkley ones that all use exactly the same layout, just with a different color choice and a different silhouette figure. And on the Coronet books, the silhouetted figure standing, basically what looks like on top of the James Bond credit. If you look, the shape is kind of weird and the figure's in an odd sort of pose. And to me, it's always looked like he's about to fall off the letters of James Bond. So I see this and it looks like he could just fall over backwards over his own name. These are fine, but I've never really liked them or understood what they were going for. And it's the same idea as the Berkley paperbacks, but I vastly prefer those because those actually work, and these have never quite worked for me, although I do find them quite funny because most of them it looks like James Bond is about to fall off his own name. Now here's an odd one. In 1990, there was a version released by Longman, that's the publisher name, and it was apparently part of their Structural Readers series. I think this was either for trying to help people improve their reading or learn how to read better or learning how to read English better. But here we have a cover where it's all black, and then we have a picture of a woman with a gold necklace and bold red lipstick that's printed in black and white, but also with color accentuations on the lipstick and the necklace. And I do not know what they were going for here, nor do I know what exactly they were trying to suggest. So this is the oddest cover of Thunderball that I'm aware of, and I'm not exactly sure what they were trying to suggest with this image. In the US, we didn't get another release until the James Bond Classic Library by MJF Books that did most of Fleming's novels in these really interesting hardcover editions that all feature moments from the stories, but with a very sort of cartoonish aesthetic and extremely bold colors. So on Thunderball, it's of course an underwater scene, but we have what is actually a depiction of the final battle. It's really just about the only cover I can think of that actually shows us the action climax of the book. So you have a figure in red, interestingly, diving after another figure with a dagger in his hand. I assume this is probably supposed to be Bond. And you've got a nice bubble trail. You see that Bond doesn't have a scuba tank on, so it adds to the level of desperation. You can see there's a sense of movement and propulsion in the image. And you can see down in the corner your eye is drawn to a flipper of an enemy, but there's also a blood trail coming up, mixing in with the bubbles. I think this is a really great cover. It's really striking and attention-grabbing. It takes you a second to fully appreciate what's going on. It shows action, it shows movement, and it's depicting the final underwater battle when apparently nobody else was brave enough to actually try that on a book cover. So I think this is another winner from the Classic Library series. It's just that the overall sort of cartoon aesthetic and bold colors may not be to everyone's liking. But I think this series overall is a really nice one to collect. It's just getting more difficult to find them in good shape, and unfortunately they did not do all of Fleming's novels. In 1996, Coronet Books in the UK brought out a matching updated series of James Bond paperbacks. This with the James Bond 007 logo matching in the top, the same font for Fleming's credit in the title, and then a singular image to represent each book. These are all very striking, and here on Thunderball, you have a diver's mask with an actual spear gun bolt going right through the glass. So this suggests, obviously, it could be from the underwater battle. It suggests the tension of the climax. It has action. It has drama. It's a wonderful singular image. I think it's an outstanding choice to fully represent the book. If I had one criticism, though, it's that the diver's mask looks a little bit modern, and these covers were trying to appeal more to a modern audience, and sometimes it does creep into the imagery and doesn't necessarily suggest the time period of the story. Outside of that, I think this is a great cover, and I think this has a great image concept, and I think it is extremely well done. In 2002, we finally got updates for the Bond books in terms of paperbacks, and this saw the release of the iconic Penguin series with the matching layouts and Ritchie Fahey artwork going for a pure Pulp Fiction aesthetic. Here on Thunderball, we have, I think, another masterful cover featuring the Bond heroine of the story, Domino, in full profile and bikini, along with diving mask and spear gun. In the central image, we have Bond fighting in the climax. Looks like he's probably fighting Largo. We have a nice green background color with aqua accents that fits into the water of the center image, and Domino herself is emerging out of the center image. And plus, you've got the added touch of the Thunderball title being in these evocative, rippling letters like they themselves are floating underwater in the depths. I think this is an outstanding cover, just like the rest of this series. It has become a fan favorite and a real collector's item. The only trouble is this cover is no longer in print. I think this is outstanding. And outside of the UK first edition with chopping artwork and maybe the 60s Signet paperback, I think this is the other definitive cover for the book. I think it is outstanding. So in the UK, Penguin brought out a new series of updated covers, but opted to not use the amazing Ritchie Fahey artwork that we got in the US. They went with this style of being all about bold, very dark covers with indistinct shapes on them. These have always puzzled me because I don't know what the shapes are supposed to be half the time, and none of them scream James Bond or indicate the type of story you're going to get. It almost looks like they took images for what might have been used for, I don't know, like a pamphlet in a car dealership or something, because a lot of them are sort of like brushed metal or reflections. But here, at least on Thunderball, it looks like liquid and water droplets in water, so I guess it suggests Thunderball because there's some sort of liquid on the cover, but I don't know what it's supposed to be. And the fact that it's mostly black and reflective, it looks more like oil than water at first glance. So the graphic design, I guess, is okay, but it doesn't suggest Thunderball or James Bond at all, so again, I've never known exactly what they were thinking with these. Penguin would do a modern classics version of Thunderball in certain countries, and as with their other modern classics Fleming titles, they just used stills from the films, and they used publicity stills or just stills of the actors. So here for Thunderball, you have a still of Sean Connery drinking, but it looks like he's either in between takes on a set, but it doesn't even look like he's necessarily on a set. It might even be a session for a foreign commercial, as he had done some foreign commercials even for alcohol. So I'm not sure why they chose this image, but the images they chose for the Modern Classics series Bond reprints are always very random, and none of them are really an element of the story. They're just random images from the films. This is magnified when you look at the other Penguin Modern Classics paperback they released with the different style they tried. They had two different styles of Modern Classics. And so here they have the tweaked new version of the font they're using, the placement of the title and author credit. But the image they chose is, of course, not from Thunderball. It's from the Fight in Osada's office in You Only Live Twice. So they didn't even bother to make sure they got a picture from the right film. So, yeah, that's a problem. It's also obviously in black and white, but they seem to have also applied some filters to it to try to make it look more distinct. So, I mean, yeah, most people are going to see this and see Connery and think, oh, yeah, James Bond, yeah. But any Bond fan sees this and immediately knows this is You Only Live Twice. So, yeah, that's just a sign of somebody not paying attention and just grabbing a random image. But, at least the design is good. The whole notion of people taking random images, of course, gets far worse when we get to covers that just use stock photos today. In 2009, we got the special edition series of amazing hardcovers with matching artwork by Michael Gillette. Each of these featured a beautiful nude female figure with the title and Fleming's credit basically sort of tattooed on their backs, as if in reference to the famous Robert McGinnis tattooed nude woman of the Casino Royale posters. Here, we have the figure rendered in a sort of off green on white, as they're all given a sort of color tint, and I can only assume this is supposed to be Domino. It's a beautiful looking cover that's very arresting and goes together nicely with the rest of the series. These have also become major collector's items and have never been reprinted, although you can actually get reproductions of the art itself from Gillette's website. In 2012, Vintage brought out a version of Thunderball in their There Is Only One Bond series. This is the rather unfortunate mixture of stock images that was done on some of the novels brought out in this style. You have a singular black and white image. You have Fleming's credit in the top with 007 faintly in the background. You have the title in a sort of gold effect, and then the There Is Only One Bond credit. But once again, as with all the covers in this series, they've basically taken an image of a location and rendered it in black and white, and then you have a generic male figure basically photoshopped in there, and that's supposed to be James Bond. Here, at least, you've got the man walking on a beach, although it looks like he's just sort of standing there. And then you just have a boat sitting there that's been beached slightly. It's a small motorboat, and there's nothing else. This doesn't really suggest Thunderball, and out of all the things you could use from the book to have wonderful, striking imagery on the cover, this is the best they could come up with. So these covers are just not good. They are basically Photoshop jobs, but they're at least consistent between them and they do match. So I will give them that. And at least somebody's taken the time to put the figure of Bond on a beach to perhaps suggest the Bahamas, and the boat maybe suggesting the search for the bombs or something. Or obviously, this might be supposed to be depicting the meeting between Bond and Domino on the beach. But they didn't have Domino or anything else. But it's still, at least it's sort of a moment from Thunderball. But I have never liked these covers. I think they are ultra generic. But unfortunately, things get much worse in the years after this. In 2012, Vintage also brought out a series called Vintage 007 in the UK. These all featured matching paperback designs with bold colored backgrounds and a hyper-stylized title with elements designed to make the letters form images that sort of suggest the book. So here it's of course blue to suggest the water theme. You've got the title thrown in on what seems to be a radar background, and instead of indicators just showing perhaps the bomber when it's hijacked, you've also got the radar indicating an actual bomb, which is also reflected in the U of the title. So this took some concepts of the book and formed a nice enough design. It's still a bit simple, and you have to look at it for a minute to piece it all together, but it does suggest the book and its plot, and I think is overall rather effective. In the US, we primarily had the Thomas and Mercer cover as part of their black, white, and red matching series of paperbacks. These will, of course, have the 007 logo in a red circle and the small black and red text for the title and Fleming's credit, along with a critical blurb on the top somewhere. Typically, these just feature random patterns and shapes, sometimes various lines, and you have to scrutinize to try to figure out what exactly they're supposed to mean or if they represent the book at all. Here you have one of the only covers I think that is actually directly and clearly representing something from the book. You see what looks like a black blob at first, then you see the lines, and then you see the shapes on the top, and you eventually realize this is probably supposed to be the Manta submarine from the end of the book, where Bond and Felix launch the final assault on the Spectre forces underwater. And you could say that the white is perhaps the water and the black of the submarine has surfaced. So it's good enough. You can actually tell what it is for a change with one of these in this series, but it doesn't really spark the imagination all that much. And you do have to look at this for a minute to even realize what it's possibly supposed to be. So it is one of the better covers in this series because you can actually tell what the thing is supposed to be on the cover, and it is something from the book, but it's at the same time rather straightforward and generic, unfortunately. In 2023, the rights to the Bond novels reverted to the Fleming estate, and through Ian Fleming Publications, they brought out a new series of paperbacks in the UK with matching design aesthetics, and then the release in the US was handled by Harper Collins. Unfortunately, this was the point where the Fleming estate decided that they needed to modernize and update the books, and that there were certain elements that would offend readers of today. So they hired sensitivity readers and selectively edited and altered Fleming's original works and reverted to the US text of Live and Let Die, which was the only change that Fleming ever authorized. They also did not make public what changes they did make, and so you have to purchase all the new editions and scrutinize and search every single page to try to find exactly what was changed and altered. And of course, all of this done decades after the original author's death. And most surprisingly of all, this was done by the estate themselves, who you would think would be the people in the world most devoted to preserving Ian Fleming's legacy. Their intent was good, of course, but this sort of thing should not ever be allowed to continue, as it is censorship, plain and simple. And unfortunately, all versions of Fleming's novels worldwide have been changed to these new altered versions, and they all carry a blanket statement that they've been changed. It is said that some of the books were not changed. However, However, they still carry this credit anyway. All that was required was a simple disclaimer at the start, as you get in any older work that might contain materials or elements that are, shall we say, dated. But unfortunately, the estate took the approach that should never be taken, and so all versions of the Bond novels that have been published since are this altered text and should be avoided and also boycotted. The 2023 UK paperback of the altered text features the matching large 007 logo that fits in with all the other covers in this series. You have the title and Fleming's credit on the top and bottom in the same white text, so this does match, except here the singular image is a spear cutting through the 007, and you have the watery background and the sort of images or shadows of the fish within. I think this works. I think it's okay. These particular covers in this series are very hit or miss, but they all do at least suggest something from the book. But they're also very one note in that you've just got a singular image and a background, and most of the focus is going to be on the giant 007 anyway. So it's okay, but it's also sedate. And you should never associate a Fleming novel with feeling sedate. However, you then look at the HarperCollins US release of the altered censored text released the next year, and this is done in the truly unfortunate, most generic of all James Bond cover design format. So this matches the other censored altered text done in the same design style, having a black background, a generic 007 in silver in the center, generic lettering for the James Bond credit, for the title and Fleming's credit, which are given a little bit of color. And then inside the zeros, you have an image of a shark. That would be fine enough and suggest at least some elements of the book, except this picture is a stock image. All of these books use stock images. Some of them you can actually find and purchase yourself for usage from photo licensing services. So you can even find them on Shutterstock. So this took no time to put together. It looks cheap, and when you get to actually see these in person, they look even cheaper. And the books themselves are rather flimsy and feel cheap in terms of the binding. And they are the modern oversized paperbacks and not the mass market size. So this, I think, is actually the most generic cover of all and the worst cover the book has ever had, because this took somebody no time at all, and I absolutely loathe this entire design series for the books. And also they carry the censored and altered text, so there is no reason to even consider these because they are not the works as originally intended and published. In 2024, IFP also designed and released their own series of hardcover special editions sold exclusively on their website, and these all feature new artwork by Michael Gillette, who returns to James Bond artwork. They all have matching white tops in terms of the design and how they've done Fleming's credit in the title, and then you have a singular image on the bottom. So for Thunderball, it's of course using the bombs themselves, with the colors being blue, black, and sort of purple, and it's arranging them into a sort of design that also looks like they're falling or being transported, and so it does suggest the themes of the story. I must admit that some of the covers in this series do have a sort of plainness to them. I think this one is probably my least favorite because the design aesthetics are good and the art itself is good. It's just, it doesn't really grab my attention all that much. But all of this is moot because, unfortunately, even though these are deluxe hardcovers sold on the estate's website, they also feature the censored and altered text, so they are worthless. However, fret not, because there is one edition still in print of the original text, and it is the most premium edition, but it's unfortunately out of the reach of most Bond fans due to the hefty price tag. And that is the beautiful Folio Society edition with its beautiful archival presentation and hard case slipcover featuring gorgeous Faye Dalton artwork, which also graces the inside of the book with some beautiful painted interior color pages. So this again is in the same matching style as the other books in the series, so they form a nice set. And the cover artwork has us underwater in the depths with Bond being menaced by the figures of the deep and what looks like also an octopus in the background. So it is absolutely gorgeous and the most premium edition of the book you can get. but it is also costing you nearly $100 here in the US, and trying to complete a set of the Folio Society editions is something that most Bond fans are just never going to be able to afford. But if you want the best that money can buy, the Folio Society edition is the finest printing available, but it is also the only version in print currently of the original unaltered text. Now, to talk about editions in my own collection, I just have 3. My Signet copy is a little on the worn side, but this has the wonderful aqua, almost sort of slightly purple tinged background, and then the wonderful artwork that so blends in. So I do think this is one of the most evocative of the Signet covers, even though this copy has obviously some wear and tear. Then we have the classic Signet white spine and the classic rear. This is actually a copy from 1964, so as you can see, it's got the original color and layout and the photo of Fleming that was used on the earlier copies, but it has been updated in the text to mention Fleming's death date and that the publication of The Man with the Golden Gun will be forthcoming in the next year of 1965. Inside you have the title page, and of course, as all copies of the book are supposed to have, the credit for McClory and Whittingham as well. You can also see that this is a 15th printing from September 1964. And of course, page 1 with the iconic Signet font and layout. My copy of the Berkeley edition has seen a ton of wear, and actually this was the first copy I ever owned, and it was in this condition even then. So when I was growing up, the Fleming novels had been out of print for some time in the US, outside of the classic library hardcovers, which I didn't really have a lot of access to. So this was my first copy of Thunderball, and as you can see, the actual color choices do appear more distinct and thus a lot better in person on a paperback copy, as opposed to just looking at a picture online of the Berkeley cover. And I like that the silhouette looks more like a photograph of a person and has detail, and it's a different type of pose as Bond is lifting a gun off the ground, and so it looks like he's in a little bit of distress. Here is the spine, and then the rear cover has the same general design as all the other Berkeley paperbacks. Here, the credit for McClory and Whittingham is actually on the copyright page, but it is still there. And you see the dedication to Ernest Cuneo, who of course came up with the original concept that started Thunderball. Another point is that this has the reset typeface that's easier to read, and so you can actually read the Fleming novels that were published by Berkeley in the same format as their John Gardner Bond novel paperbacks. And then here is my copy of the 2002 paperback with the astonishing Ritchie Fahey artwork, and this looks even better in person because you get to marvel over the fine details, and there's even slight embossing in terms of the letters of the title. I don't know if you can really see it on camera, but you can actually see them stand out in the light, and they have an extra sort of gleam to them. So this is just beautifully done. Plus it has the matching spine that is wraparound, because these do feature wraparound artwork going into the uniform rear cover aesthetic with Bond holding gun on the top corner. And you've also got Domino's hair being referenced, it looks like, because she's here again on the rear cover in diving mask, and her hair is going into the water and the waves in the water. So it's just really beautifully done, and the whole thing just flows into each side beautifully. Inside, there's always the iconic image of Fleming printed in the actual interior cover. Here you have the new Penguin title page. Again, the credit for McClory and Whittingham is tucked into the copyright page. And then here is page 1 and what the font and layout looks like. And then these would always include the updated Literary 007 logo in a circle on the rear cover, printed with some sort of color or aesthetic suggesting the book. So here it's of course underwater. Overall, I think Thunderball is still a very good novel, but it has to be examined within the greater confines of the overall Thunderball saga to be fully appreciated, analyzed, and understood. And since the Thunderball story began life as a proposed film of the James Bond character, it didn't originate with Fleming himself, so it is always going to be slightly removed from the other Bond novels. but the book itself is in keeping with where Fleming had taken the James Bond character and is already moving us even further closer to the final stage of the Bond novels and how Fleming was writing those with a different emphasis than how he started the series. So it is important as a transitional work in terms of Fleming's Bond novels and how they were growing and changing. You get a greater sense of the malaise Fleming was feeling and what the Bond character himself was feeling. And this, I think, is reflected best in the book's opening line, which I think is one of Fleming's absolute best opening lines. And I think this moment that opens the book actually summarizes where the James Bond character was headed and where Fleming's own mental space was at that time. I think this represents it fully, and I do think it is one of Fleming's best opening lines. And it is, of course, it was one of those days when it seemed to James Bond that all life, as someone put it, was nothing but a heap of 6-4 against. I still think that's one of the great lines in all of literature because it is full of Fleming's wit. It's, of course, got a gambling reference. It's also talking about the endless weight that is life itself in terms of everything that weighs down every mortal person. So it is absolutely relatable, but it's got that tinge of the sardonic, the tinge of the cynical, and it's so beautifully self-contained that you hope that if you are a writer, you're ever able to write something so evocative in a single sentence and have that be the opening of the book. So I do think it is another masterful opening line, and I do think that summarizes beautifully where Fleming was sort of at this point and where the James Bond character was actually headed, because you get that greater sense of the internal malaise that's building up that really, I think, starts in the Goldfinger novel. It is a great reading experience as a book, but when you're reading the Bond books, I do think it is the weakest up to this point because of the infusion of other people's voices who aren't Fleming. It doesn't feel 100% as unbridled Fleming energy and full of the Fleming sweep as the other books have. And even though it's got more of Fleming's creative powers in terms of it being the 9th book as opposed to the first book and having all of those building up confidence as a writer, it just doesn't feel as consistent as what we've seen in the books leading up to this. And if you didn't know about the overall Thunderball saga and how this started life, you might wonder why the book felt a certain way. And you also might have wondered why the films were a certain way, because they're only picking up on what's in the book, which of course is drawn from the Thunderball project itself. So all of this plays into every aspect of Thunderball and all the adaptations of Thunderball. Thankfully, Fleming's writing voice runs throughout the book, and there's enough new material that he has inserted into the book and taken from his original treatments or reverted back to his ideas that were rejected. So there's enough of the Fleming voice to have this recognizable as the literary James Bond and part of the series, but it's stuck adapting the work that was done with other people who were not trying to make this story part of the established literary James Bond canon. They were trying to make this as something that would appeal to 1950s film audiences and especially the American market, and trying to reintroduce James Bond to people who had never heard of him. So the Thunderball novel's always having to deal with that. So there's this schism that you've always got to figure in when analyzing the book's effectiveness. So there are moments that I absolutely adore and cherish and I think are among Fleming's best passages. But everything you remember and love from this book is typically the Fleming original material that has nothing to do with the plot. It's Bond struggling through at Shrublands. It's Bond readjusting to needing to live the way he did and having to talk to the wonderful May in his flat and finally coming to the realization that life is too short to live on health food. Or Felix Leiter entering the book and bringing all this wonderful energy back, but also the wonderful scene where he's chewing out the barman for trying to serve him a watered-down martini. And probably best of all is the sense of depth in the Domino characterization and the wonderful scene of her telling Bond about her hero, the player's cigarette sailor. So there are advances over the past books, and there is a sign of Fleming growing further as a writer and developing the Bond character and the Bond world further and leading to what would come next, but always with the caveat that he's adapting the Thunderball scripts that were not entirely 100% his. And then you go back to the court case and the Thunderball Saga and the development. So again, you can't look at this book without examining the Thunderball Saga and considering that this book is part of that and really at the core of it. So those are my thoughts on revisiting and rereading Thunderball for the umpteenth time and reflecting on its place not just in the literary James Bond canon, but of course its place at the center of the Thunderball Saga. As always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond and the literary James Bond have been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you're a Bond fan who's never really delved into the Thunderball Saga or how the story came to be and what happened in regards to the novel and the film adaptations, you're really doing yourself a disservice because it helps in appreciating any version of the story or the novel to understand the historical context and the background of how the story came to be in the first place, because the development of Thunderball and the scripts and treatments are what inform every version of the story and is what Fleming was working from in writing his novel. As always, I would like to say please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some lovely James Bond editions to add to your collection, and hopefully by some slim chance you might be able to find a copy of the indispensable Battle for Bond by Robert Sellers, but that is unfortunately still very expensive on the used market. So until I return with a video on Fleming's The Spy Who Loved Me, I just want to say keep reading print books, keep bonding, and thank you ever so much for watching.